Okay, my name is Kanishka Goonewardena, and I'm going to moderate the second session, which is about left responses, to the crisis, however you want to understand it. Three renowned political scientists for this session: Laurie Adkin from the University of Alberta, Hanieh from York University, and Panitch also from York University. So we'll go roughly in the order that's in the program: Laurie, Adam, and Leo. And our plan is to keep each of the presentations to about 20 minutes, so that we will have almost an hour for discussion. So I'm not going to take any more time. Let's start with Laurie.
Okay. Hello. I was asked not too long ago to do this, so I have put together some observations and comments and criticisms mostly of the current Conservative government response to the financial crisis in the form of the budget and some of the early announcements. And I'm going to look at this from the point of view of ecological economics and from a gender perspective as well. Obviously, there's a great deal that could be said about alternatives, and I'm only going to be able to address some of these things in a fairly piecemeal fashion here. Judging by the kinds of questions that we got at the last session, I'm quite sure that the rest of you can fill this all in very, very well. Okay, so I think we agree that this is an opportunity to address some very major social and ecological problems, instead of worsening them by patching together an unsustainable and unjust economic system. And what is needed is investment in comprehensive ecological restructuring of the economy and in a social infrastructure. Well, the Harper government's been pushed to increase federal spending on infrastructure projects, referring to these in its pre-budget statements as getting shovels in the ground or shovel-ready road, sewer, bridge projects. The speech from the throne outlined a 6-point action plan that included infrastructure spending, ensuring access to credit, stabilizing financial institutions, and helping the most vulnerable. And the same day, Infrastructure Minister James Baird announced $7 billion of infrastructure spending. And he added that the government was trying to cut red tape, in his words, again, a very common kind of theme used in neoliberal discourse, to get these funds flowing quickly. And apparently that red tape includes environmental assessment processes. And they've said something about wanting to harmonize these or reduce them to one type of process, but they haven't given any details yet about what this means. They've also, in doing this, reconstructed the economy versus the environment opposition. And they have mentioned significant funding connected to the Mackenzie gas pipeline project, which one assumes is intended to accelerate the approval process, which has been stalled in a sense, but slow, because it's been a different process, and that the investors are very, very anxious to get this approval through. So, in addition to the $7 billion for infrastructure, the government confirmed a number of other spending measures in the budget. None of these has been tied to ecological transition goals, to ecological criteria. So, huge, huge wasted opportunity here. $1.5 billion to help train laid-off workers and provide them with new skills. $1 billion to help communities adjust to economic downturn, especially one-industry towns. $1 billion to renovate social housing. $600 million for Aboriginal housing. $550 million for farmers. $150 million to help the forestry sector develop new technologies and to promote the industry abroad. And billions of dollars in loan guarantees for the auto industry, $2.7 billion from the Government of Canada through and support that's going to be offered through Export Development Canada. Overall, the Conservatives have estimated that the spending over the next 2 years will create a budgetary deficit of $64 billion. What they haven't made so much of is the fact that about half of this is actually due to tax cuts as opposed to spending. So there are some positive steps in what's been announced, but very clearly we are very, very far from what is needed. We're very far from anything resembling a comprehensive cross-sectoral strategy for ecological transition with the consistent application of ecological criteria to all investment decisions. There's no plan to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is a major economic issue. It should be integral to the budget. And we also need long-term commitments to social program spending, guided by equity criteria and linked to green economic restructuring. And in addition, some of the measures that have been proposed so far are perverse in ecological terms. For example, tax cuts aimed at encouraging citizens to spend more on consumer goods, building additional roads for automobiles, or providing credit to encourage Canadians to buy or lease vehicles. They also appear to be highly imbalanced in terms of gender equity. So I want to come back to a point that Pat had touched on before. And shovel-ready certainly harkens back to the idea of paying men to dig ditches and fill them up again, which was something that Keynes said with regard to the last depression. And to the idea in the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal, of the emphasis on creating jobs in the building of roads and dams and electric systems. Certainly there are urgent infrastructural needs in Canada, such as clean water on reserves, extended public transportation, energy efficient, affordable housing. But insofar as these demand construction workers, skilled tradespersons, or unskilled laborers to build roads, work on water and sewer systems, $4 billion has been set aside for that, or to build houses, or to build and repair university facilities, no mention of people, just buildings. This spending will generate disproportionately jobs for men. Okay? And the same can be said of investment in the forestry and automobile sectors, and very likely of the programs to retrain laid-off workers in mining, forestry, and manufacturing. Many of these jobs will be short-term and will not endow workers with the education and the skills needed in the sectors that are expected to grow in the future. Well-paid jobs for women are typically not found in digging, construction and resource extraction industries, but in the public service, in administration, and in the so-called human services, education, medicine, social work. And these are, in Canada, largely public funded. We have huge infrastructure needs here, too. Hospital beds, nurses, doctors, teachers, university funding, childcare, elder care, pharmacare, home care, mental health care, anything really that has care in it would be a predominantly women's, given the existing sexual division of labor, predominantly a women's sector of employment. We could also use an increase in the minimum wage to a living wage that's indexed to the cost of living. So jobs in human services and public administration require post-secondary education, as do jobs in research. But addressing these infrastructural needs calls for increased long-term program spending, to which the Harper Conservatives are adamantly ideologically opposed. Also, very little has been said or promised by way of support for the IT sector. It seems to be going unnoticed that not only auto workers but also research engineers are being laid off and IT firms are closing. At the same time, university budgets to hire lecturers or continuing faculty are shrinking or being frozen. And so one might ask here whether the Harper Conservatives are transposing to the national level the anti-intellectualism and populism of their provincial counterparts in Alberta, which I know so well, along with their antipathy to publicly funded childcare and other programs that facilitate women's workforce participation. Pat also mentioned the pay equity issue. The only place actually in the 360-page budget that the word equity appears, and when it doesn't refer to equity markets or equity as shares, is in that paragraph on pay equity legislation. Perversely, yes. An ecological transition requires a reorientation of public policy in a number of ways. And what I want to do here is just outline some general directions, and then insofar as I have time, talk about some of them in more concrete policy terms. And I'm sure that this will be familiar to you. You've all no doubt heard a great deal at this point from environmental organizations and others around the general ways in which we need to be restructuring economies. So this is, some of it will not be new to you. So for example, to start with, it's pretty clear that we need to shift from a fossil fuel-based economy to alternatives, so solar, biomass, conservation, and that we need to think about agriculture in terms of ecologically sustainable agriculture, local food production, shifting from linear to cyclical production processes. Technological orientation, innovation rather, needs to be oriented toward the maximization of the productivity of resources rather than the maximization of the productivity of labor. We need to increase opportunities for employment rather than continue to shed labor through technological innovation, which is aimed at increasing profitability by reducing labor costs. We also need to shift taxation bases from the taxation of labor to the taxation of resource use. Contrary to the tidal wave of statement that's been coming from political leaders around the world, encouraging people to go out and consume to save the world, from an ecological perspective, what's needed is promoting sufficiency as a good life and not consumption. There's a huge, huge contradiction here. And we know that only months before the crisis kind of imploded, there was a lot of attention being paid to issues about personal debt, which seemed to be a huge problem, and now we're encouraging people to go further into debt to try to keep the economy floating. This is particularly important for the United States. So much of its economy is based on consumer spending. Investment in the North in social infrastructure, building on education, qualitative type of growth, these create good jobs and improve well-being. Another general direction is the deceleration rather than the acceleration of economic processes and transportation norms. Slowing down is a simpler way of putting it. Reducing the distances over which economic inputs and goods are transported, and generally encouraging greater local self-sufficiency, which actually brings me to a point that Brenda made in the first session about the importance of building sustainable and resilient local communities, which is very much part of ecological thinking as well. And then many have argued that we need to revamp the national accounting system to report on genuine progress indicators or something like that, and to get away from the kind of system of accounts that we use now, which puts equal value on bad things as it does on the good things, so long as somebody spends money on it. Okay, so I want to look, I would say that the Conservatives' budget is severely lacking in recognition of the environmental crises facing us. Few of its tax credit or other subsidy proposals are linked to increasing energy efficiencies or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The budget document addresses environmental concerns on only 2 pages in a section very tellingly titled, "A More Sustainable Environment." I don't know who wrote that, but it's very interesting. It's the environment that's a problem. Okay. The target for greenhouse gas emissions that this government has accepted, at least in words, is woefully inadequate. And there's almost an exclusive focus on future carbon capture and storage technology as the path to transformation to the green energy economy, a term they use, the green energy economy. This approach parallels that taken by the Stelmach government in Alberta, which has already created a $2 billion investment fund for the oil and gas sector to develop carbon capture and storage technology. So they got another gift in this budget. And this approach There's also the approach they take to the green energy economy includes an emphasis on nuclear power, which is highlighted in the budget and presented in this way. Nuclear technology is a proven and reliable source of clean energy. In Canada and around the world, energy authorities are investing in nuclear power to meet energy security and climate change goals. So they allocated $351 million to AECL for 2009-2010. Canada, as a result of the Conservatives' intransigent refusal to implement any serious economic strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, whether carbon taxes or a cap-and-trade system, is far behind other OECD countries. And it's also far behind in terms of supporting a green technology sector. Nevertheless, the Liberals saw fit to support a budget that contained nothing of their own Green Shift program that they had so recently campaigned on. I know, you're saying, are you surprised? Yes, I know. Okay. So, measures to conserve energy and to shift from fossil fuels to renewable resources, or renewable sources of energy, have been proposed by many environmentalists, ecological economists, ENGOs. Clearly, one of the key things that one would hope for in a federal budget would be a significant investment in alternatives to fossil fuels and in energy conservation. These alternatives are job creating and they are critical to stop global warming. So this means shifting investment from fossil fuel subsidies to wind, solar, and geothermal technologies and the subsidies needed to get them to consumers. These are also research and technology producing jobs. On the second point, which would be something like a cap-and-trade system or carbon taxes for cutting greenhouse gas emissions, there are some large remaining question marks around what specifically is the best policy route to go. There are also possibilities for combinations of these. So one thing which there's some consensus on, I would say, in the environmental community is a cap-and-trade system, although there's not opposition to carbon taxes, but cap-and-trade is considered to be somewhat more equitable and is predicted by the Pembina Institute to generate $29 billion in revenue per year. So if you're thinking on the revenue side of a kind of green transition, there is a lot of attention to ways in which revenue will be raised through cap-and-trade system or carbon taxes and other measures, in addition to the spending side of the equation. And there doesn't seem to be any attention to the revenue side in the existing budget. My own preference actually is for carbon rationing over a carbon tax approach, but I don't have time to go into that, and I'm not an expert on that in any case, but my reading has led me to that conclusion. The third measure we would hope to see would be incentives for a shift from use of private vehicles to public transportation and to stopping urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is a huge cause of climate change, global warming, and is very strongly underpinned by a lot of interconnected interests from automobile producers to developers, speculators, construction companies, and it's something that calls for action at a municipal level, but with support from other levels. So rather than simply give money to the automakers, as I argued in an earlier op-ed thing that some of you may have seen, there are other options for governments, such as buying controlling shares in some of these companies, requiring the conversion of plants to produce environmentally sustainable products, electric buses, trains, pollution-reducing products like solar panels, and other components for renewable energy technologies. Now, clearly, this is a way of creating long-term sustainable jobs that involve research skills and position Canada very well to deal with what's coming in terms of climate change and energy scarcity. So under that general point of that shift to public transportation and stopping urban sprawl, I have a number of other points, but I don't think I'm going to have time to go into them in any detail. We could certainly have seen in this budget increased public investment in public transportation systems and tying this to production in Canada, sourcing in Canada. Another measure in a green budget would be building low-cost, energy-efficient housing and incentives for energy-saving retrofitting. Again, an area that's expected to create many, many jobs requires training of thousands of people to do the installation work and to learn the technologies. There are different estimates from some of the different angos about the number of jobs that could be created with different amounts of investment. The budget's home renovation tax credit is not conditional on the renovations being energy saving. And this is really a lost opportunity to help people do something that will greatly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase their net incomes in the long term. The government does say that it will provide a one-time federal investment of $1 billion over 2 years for renovations and energy retrofits for up to 200,000 social housing units on a 50-50 cost-shared basis with the provinces. It's not clear, however, what portion of this amount will actually be allocated to the energy retrofits, and it's clearly not sufficient. The Pembina Institute is calling for a $2.5 billion investment over the next 5 years in the retrofitting of homes and commercial buildings, plus $500 million for training workers in this sector. In addition, Pembina wants $1 billion for the investment, or wants $1 billion of this investment to be earmarked for low-income homeowners or renters, schools, and small businesses, and to include the multiple-unit social housing sector. They also have some interesting policy ideas involving loans to homeowners that they will pay back in a fashion that corresponds to their energy savings, so that ultimately it's a no-cost loan to encourage people to do energy retrofitting. Okay, so there's a lot more that could be said on that, but I want to just move quickly to investment in social infrastructure. Some of you won't be surprised to hear me say at the top of my list that we need a national child care program. This would require the educating and employing of thousands of early childhood educators. This is obviously a major spending, long-term spending commitment. It's been estimated that a program that would be reasonably comprehensive nationally would cost $10 billion a year. Sounds like a lot, but I believe that that is about 1% of Canada's GDP. Yeah. And we actually lost $12 billion a year with the cuts to the GST. So with that, we could have funded a child care program. Investments in child care and in affordable energy-efficient housing reduce poverty and homelessness. The introduction of publicly funded child care in Quebec contributed to a decrease in the number of single mothers living in poverty from 60% to 30% from 1997 to 2007. Clearly, we also need to address infrastructure needs on reserves. The Harper government reneged on the federal accord with First Nations that was signed by the Martin government earlier. Leading up to the January 2009 budget, Assembly of First Nations National Chief Bill Fontaine presented the government with $3 billion of infrastructure needs, including clean water, schools, and housing. And according to the expert panel on safe drinking water for First Nations that reported in April 2008, approximately $530 million is needed to ensure safe drinking water on all 600 First Nations reserves. The budget proposes $1.4 billion of investment in Aboriginal priority issues, but then it lumps everything into that. Just about that. Okay, I could talk about investment in other programs, education, public research, health services, elder care. Income support is another area where we could have seen a substantial investment, and that one would have thought was a very rational response to the nature of the current crisis. You know, that instead of this sort of scattergun approach where, you know, they're throwing a little bit here and there, a real focus on preventing collapse in income and spending power might have been something to think about. So again, the point about increasing minimum wage would be an important policy to consider. Extending eligibility for employment insurance, which didn't happen, which many have argued was an important measure. The Caledon Institute of Social Policy argues that coverage should be increased, employment insurance coverage. Currently only 44% of unemployed Canadians qualify for benefits, and this is much lower in at least 6 provinces. The replacement wage should also be increased to at least 70–75%. It's now at 55% of average insurable earnings. Likewise, for maternity and parental leave benefits, the replacement wage should be increased to around 80% of insurable earnings to make this benefit accessible to people who do not have employer top-ups or employment situations that allow them to actually benefit from those leave opportunities. And lastly, there's so many things. We could also talk about creating a more progressive, redistributive tax system, which, you know, people always talk about, you know, the war on poverty, and I say, well, why are we having a war on poverty? Why don't we have a war on the rich? Anyway, so increase taxes on the wealthy, reduce premiums for unemployment insurance to support small business. In October 2008, the OECD reported that since 1998, Canada's gap between rich and poor has grown to become one of the largest in the OECD. And then I won't get into the investment fund managers' compensations, but that's another issue that can certainly receive attention in this context. I just want to end on a couple of political suggestions, moving away from kind of economic policy areas. Support for university research is important in a number of ways that are not only economic, right? Important for providing, it's a very important resource for civil society organizations across the spectrum. And also public broadcasting, without which we have no way of communicating investigative or doing investigative journalism and communicating it to a broad public. And the declining capacity of the CBC to do any of this is, I think, hugely significant politically. It's a huge problem of resources for the left. And it's one that the Harper himself, I believe, is extremely aware of as well. I think he has a very Gramscian perspective, from a right-wing perspective, on the way of undermining the resources for progressive culture and politics. And this is part of the agenda. And also, I don't know why we never talk about it, but we need a proportional representation electoral system. You know, we've gone through the parliamentary crisis and the coalition and all the rest of it, but you know, this is kind of opening up, I think, an opportunity to come back to the question of how our electoral system it cripples progressive politics in various ways. But I'm going to stop.
Thanks, Laurie. Adam.
Okay, I guess the main point that I'm want to speak about, the main point that the main focus of this talk is more of a critique of how the left and progressive movements, social movements, are conceiving the crisis, or at least the dominant way of talking about the crisis. In particular, I want to say that we talk a lot about auto bailouts, for example, in the United States, the foreclosures that are happening in California, the emerging banking crisis in the UK, the bankruptcy of Iceland and the collapse of the Iceland government a few days ago. But what seems to be left out of this is the impact of the crisis on the South and on the global nature of the crisis. What I want to say is that this is not just a question of looking at the rest of the world, not just a question of looking at where the majority of the world's population lives, but actually realizing that capitalism itself solves its problem through geographical displacement or spatial displacement of crisis. And in this context, it means that the people who are most going to suffer in this, as capitalism reworks the system, are the people in the South. And that's where we need to talk about what it means for those of us living in the North. So I'm going to talk about three particular points. Firstly is to make some theoretical points about the crisis and what does it mean to see the crisis in a global system or in a global context. Secondly, to look very briefly at some of the impacts on the South of the crisis that are already starting to be felt. And thirdly, to look at implications or political implications for the left. So to begin with, as I said, I think we need to see this crisis very much as a global crisis, and to understand how the global economy itself formed over the last couple of decades under neoliberalism. To see that this historicization of the global system really tells us a lot about what the crisis means, why it happened, and also how it will be, or how capitalism will attempt to resolve it. During the 1980s, under neoliberalism, what happened in the world market was a restructuring of the global system into a hierarchical structure where every country, every nation state, every region in the globe was inserted into this hierarchy for the benefit of the most powerful corporations concentrated in the advanced capitalist centre. Places such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Europe, Japan. That during the 1980s, under neoliberalism, this restructuring of the world market in a hierarchical fashion, of course their hierarchies existed before this, but what was special about neoliberalism and the last couple of decades was that it really deepened the internationalization of capital at a global level. What this means is not just, and I don't mean to use internationalization in the facile sense that a lot of globalization talk, just the traversal of capital across borders, but rather that every commodity that we consume, every commodity that is produced, involves the labor of thousands of people spread across the globe. That all commodities are produced in these interconnected chains of production, of marketing, of subcontracting, and finally of realization of value across the globe. That production and realization of value doesn't occur just at the national scale, or it doesn't occur at the national scale, it occurs and it is conceived at a global scale. With each scale, whether it be the national, whether it be a regional scale, whether it even be at a city level or even sub-national scales, fit into this internationalization, oriented towards internationalization of capital. I don't mean to imply by this that the state or the nation state is any way unimportant. In fact, that the nation state is more important in this context, as Leo and others have talked about, that what actually manages and it ensures the accumulation capabilities of capital at the through this process is the nation state and other state institutions. So over the last 2 decades under neoliberalism, this kind of hierarchical layering has taken 3 particular forms for the South. I'm speaking for the South. Firstly, we have many low-wage or the relocation of production to low-wage and poorly regulated zones, whether it be places such as China, which everyone here is familiar with, and there has been discussion around this. India, Mexico, parts of Latin America, many places across the globe. This, I don't mean to imply that companies just shut down their production here and moved it overseas. It's not like that. Rather that there was, it combined with introduction of labour-saving technology, productivity increases in places such as in the core countries, but the recentering of manufacturing into these low-wage and poorly regulated zones. And this was also reproduced at a regional level. For example, in places in Asia, you have economic processing zones where, in places such as Malaysia or Singapore, where low-wage labour from around the region fits into more of a regional chain of production, perhaps ending up in China where goods are then exported elsewhere. Secondly, the second kind of form of linkage that many countries took in this structure was as labour exporters. Exporters of labour, either to the advanced capitalist countries or to other zones such as these economic processing zones that we see around the world. In particular, places, Latin America is the major, or was one of the major places where this labour export takes place. And some countries, if you look at some of the figures like Honduras, where 26% of GDP actually comes from labour remittances, money that is remitted from labour that is sent elsewhere. Or Guyana, 24%, Haiti, 22%. So Latin America and the Caribbean is kind of one of the major zones, but not restricted obviously to that. For example, in Indonesian workers in Asia, there are 400,000 Indonesian workers spread within the Asian region in places such as Malaysia and Singapore. So this kind of labour export is another way that countries kind of inserted themselves into these global systems. And finally, as exporters of raw commodities and raw materials. Once again, you can see this very clearly in, for example, the region of Africa, where a lot of mineral production takes place, but also, of course, the Middle East, in particular the oil exporting countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. So these kinds of, I'm not meaning to imply that these are the only forms of linkages that countries have, and I'm certainly not meaning to imply that every country only has one form. For example, Mexico is a country that not only has low-wage production, it also exports oil. A third of, I think, Mexico's foreign income comes from the sale of oil, or a third of government revenues. And also remittances is another big export, or labour exports or a country like Mexico. So within this hierarchical system, at the other end, of course, was the realization of value in the advanced capitalist core. And we know this very well with the dominance of the US and US consumption in the dominance of US consumption in GDP and also of world demand. This system, as this system developed over the 80s, it of course required the rollback of national development projects. Attempts by states to control their own economies, to try and pursue their own development policies. And of course, leading the charge on this, not the sole instruments, but leading the charge were the IMF and the World Bank, as part of like breaking through or breaking down national borders. And finally, the other aspect that I would say, just in this very brief and incomplete survey of this system, is the role that finance and financialization played in the process. And this, I think, is very important to understand. Finance really underpinned the process of internationalization of capital. Finance enabled internationalized chains of production to manage risk, to compare prices, to manage fluctuations in prices across the global economy. And this was one of the real driving forces for instruments such as derivatives and other financial products. And also, finance enabled neoliberalism in the United States to coexist with the expanded consumption that took place at the end of this. So, moving quickly on to the second part of how do we see this, or how can we see this crisis, or how can we understand the crisis in the context of this global system. And I want to make the point, and it's a strong point, that the destruction of capital, which is necessary to solve this crisis from the perspective of capital, the destruction of capital will most impact the South. That is where the real pain, if you want to put it that way, will be felt in the countries of the South. For example, with the collapse of manufacturing that is occurring across the globe, we are seeing in the South many cases of countries whose whole manufacturing exports are being decimated, and growth is being decimated. Turkey, for example, there has been a 40% collapse in some of the key manufacturing exports of Turkey, such as automobiles and other things, mostly to the European markets. We know in China, for example, it seems that growth is going to be around the 5%, or is predicted between 5 to 7%, whereas China needs around 9 to 10% growth to absorb the 24 million people who enter the labour market each year. So this is a huge social dislocation that is occurring as this crisis unfolds. In terms of those countries that were exporters of migrant labour, as construction, for example, in the United States collapses, as manufacturing in China collapses, and elsewhere collapses, there is also a collapse in remittance flows back to these countries. For example, El Salvador, which relies on these remittances for 70% of its national income, really you wonder what will happen to a country like El Salvador when these migrant workers lose their jobs. Also to point out that these this labour doesn't necessarily show up in unemployment figures in the United States or places like Canada, because much of the labour is considered illegal and therefore may not show up in the national statistics. And also we need to consider in this, if these workers go home, the impact that it has on unemployment levels in those countries. And finally, the third category I mentioned, the primary commodity exports. The drop in demand has been very rapid and very quick as manufacturing demand has plunged. For example, one example of this is a measure called the Baltic Dry Index, the BDI, which measures the cost of shipping on large tankers, Cape-sized tankers they're called, for example, where things such as iron and coal and steel is shipped. The BDI index has dropped by 92% from June to January. 92%. So where it used to cost $234,000 per day to hire one of these big tankers, it now costs just over $2,000 a day. So you can see this dramatic drop in value, which is a reflection of a drop in world demand for primary commodities. So this will have a very big impact on Latin America and Africa. For example, Zambia, which has already seen its foreign currency revenues drop by 2/3 since October. And this is a country where unemployment levels are in some places quote 50% unemployment levels. So the final part of the crisis, or its impact, we need to see in terms of the financial implications and the drop of financial flows into countries in the south. For example, the sale of so-called emerging market debt has dropped very dramatically over the last couple of months, meaning that countries find it difficult to attract the capital necessary to keep their economies functioning. And then we need to put all of this in the context, this is after 2 decades of neoliberalism, where countries are much more susceptible to the effects of this crisis, and coinciding with the environmental crisis. The fact that the environmental crisis and the impact of the environmental crisis is most severely felt in the south. And also, these are the areas of the world with the least capacity to respond. So what we are seeing is a return in many cases of the IMF. The IMF, which would, just a year or so ago was seen as like being outmoded and not necessarily trying to find its role, and all these discussions about, what's going to happen to the IMF. It's come back with a vengeance, imposing very harsh structural adjustment programs in return for capital to ameliorate some of the worst effects of the crisis. So, just to move to the last part of my talk, which is on the political implications, and what does this mean for the left here in Canada, and places such as Canada. The first thing I want to say is that I don't think that we are going to see, and I think it's inaccurate to describe the response of the capitalist state in North America and elsewhere as Keynesian. I think that what we are seeing is a return, or a very much a hardened form of neoliberalism, a neoliberalism that will use this crisis to restructure at the expense of the poor, and that means the poor here, but also it means the geographical displacement of the crisis to the south. And it is important to have, therefore, and I think we can see this in some sections of the labour movement, there is a tendency or a temptation to retreat into bread and butter issues. To say, well, at this turn, what's going on in the south doesn't really concern us. We have to worry about our jobs here. We have to worry about conditions here. The international outlook we'll leave to a better day. But I want to say that this is very dangerous, not just because it's wrong, but also because if capital succeeds in restructuring at a global level, it means worse conditions for people here. It means the system will regenerate itself at the expense. It will continue to do what it does to people here as well. So we have to, I think, very much as the first implication I would say is to reassert internationalism and an international outlook in the way that we respond to the crisis. That means supporting solidarity, international solidarity struggles, and seeing that very much as a core aspect of the labour movement, not something that's an add-on or just because we want to do charity. Okay, it's actually a core aspect of defending and fighting capitalism here. The second thing is to see the way that this global system is reflected here in the core. For example, one of the ways this happens is through migrant workers here in cities such as Toronto. And we can see, I think this also has to be a very much a mandate of the left and social movements, is defending the rights of migrant workers as they come and work here. And as I said, in many cases they're considered illegal, but the labour movement needs to take these up as struggles here. Because one of the ways that if this kind of geographical, spatial relocation of capital takes place, or a crisis takes place, it means an increase in racism here in the core as a way of justifying and allowing this to happen. Thirdly, it also means a more militaristic and expansionist state in the core. So it means, for example, and we can see this very clearly in Canada with Canadian military involvement overseas, but also of the United States. So resisting that type of militarism is very important. Fourthly, the role of realizing that this reconstruction of the role of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank and other financial institutions in the South needs also to be resisted here, whether through solidarity struggles or finding ways of showing support to people in struggle. And finally, and most importantly, what I've been saying is absolutely not meant to imply that what is happening or what the crisis means for people in the advanced capitalist countries is going to be fine, that nothing, we should just worry about what's happening overseas. I'm not trying to say that at all, but rather that the crisis will be deeply felt here by, as I said, the poor and workers in general, that we need to find ways of linking the struggles that do take place here, whether it be at the level of the city or at the level of the country as a whole, with international solidarity and international struggles. Thank you.
As Rosemary said, the Journal of Studies in Political Economy was founded 30 years ago. Its first issue came out, I think, in the spring of 1979. And a good part of the year before that was spent in arguments, mostly in a Chinese restaurant, over whether the term "a socialist review" should be put underneath it. We knew this might affect government funding, and I remember, in fact, Joran Therborn, who published an article in one of the early issues saying he couldn't believe that the government would help fund a scholarly journal that had the word socialist in its title. It would never happen in Sweden. And we argued this through and decided we were socialist intellectuals, both in terms of what we looked for analysis and in terms of what our values and goals were. And we should make that explicit. That was taking place at a time when capitalism was going through the crisis of the 1970s. The decision to do that, I think, was very much associated with the understanding that what Keynesians didn't get, and what social democrats who had become Keynesians in their great majority didn't get, was that you can't harmonize capitalism, you can't do away with exploitation within capitalism, and you can't avoid the chaos of capitalism. And that was showing itself in the 1970s, and it was clear to a great many of us, I think, that unless one moved beyond the regulations and income supports of the Keynesian welfare state, one was going to lose some of those reforms. As capitalism had been nurtured back to health in the post-war period and now exploded in its dynamic competitiveness beyond the ability of those forms to contain capitalism's dynamism. It had thrown up contradictions, partly by virtue of the reforms, insofar as people had income supports or had full employment. They were indeed impinging on capital in ways that led it to attempt to undo some of those reforms. So you had to get at the question that socialists had always gotten at, which was an understanding of how capitalism works to the end of explaining that socialist goals were required to achieve social justice. And what the left's response to the reemergence of crisis today often reminds me of an old Jewish joke. A poor man who lives in a small village in the country goes to the rabbi and says, "I can't stand it. I'm going to kill myself. We live in a one-room hut. We have 4 children. My parents live with us. It's so stifling that we can barely breathe. And the rabbi says, do you own a cow? And he says, yes. He says, take it into the house. And the man says, what are you talking about? I'm telling you, it's horrible. Take the cow in. He brings the cow in. He comes back a week later. He says, it's worse than ever. I can't stand it. He says, do you own any dogs? Yes. Bring the dogs in the house. Goes back, takes the dogs in. Of course, it's even worse. He goes back the following week and says, Rabbi, this is impossible. Do you have any chickens? Yes, we have chickens. Bring the chickens. Finally, he goes back the next week, and the rabbi says, okay, I know it's terrible. Take 2 chickens out. The guy goes back this week and says, Rabbi, you're a genius. There's so much room. And what we're facing today with all of this discussion of whether there's been enough Keynesianism or not enough Keynesianism is, should you take 2 chickens out or should you take 4 chickens out? And I think the critique of the budget is to some extent in that vein. I want to talk about, from a socialist perspective, and I want to talk to the left in that sense, some do's and don'ts if we're going to talk about alternatives. And of course it's easier to start with the don'ts. So that's where I'll begin. Let me begin with 3 don'ts. First of all, I think that we need to not see our role as that of calling for more prudential regulation and a truer Keynesianism. Not only because of the social justice questions associated with Keynesian economics, which of course does not have built into it in terms of its notion of deficit financing a feminist dimension. That's not what it's about. Of course, if they happen to be a feminist, they may say do this rather than that, but that's not what it's about. It's about deficit spending. But I think for a more fundamental reason. And that is that, you know, one tends to think that if you bail out the banks or regulate them prudentially, and if you put enough fiscal stimulus in, you'll get the capitalist economy going again. And there's a very large question at the moment as to whether that is in fact the case. That is, a macroeconomic deficit which assumes there will be a multiplier effect may not happen, precisely because the banking system, not because it doesn't want to lend, but because it can't lend. Not because bankers are greedy and cruel, but because the system is now dysfunctional. The whole basis of lending, the credit system, has been based on securitization over the last 30, 40, 50 years. It's one of the reasons that the old regulations got exploded. And banks have been used to lending out and then slicing and dicing and repackaging those loans. And that has seized up. And that's not only seized up in domestic credit markets, it's seized up, as Adam was suggesting, in international trade and bond credit markets, which people in a great many countries, not only in the third world, but the periphery of Europe, are now facing. And then secondly, we have to recognize that a macroeconomic stimulus of the kind we're talking about still runs up against, and this was referred to a number of times today, the central irrationality of capitalism. The micro-rationality of every employer trying to save himself by laying off or cutting the wages of his particular employees. Understandably, right? From preventing himself from going bankrupt. Right? But the macro irrationality of that is that if everybody does it, there's no consumers to buy their stuff. This is the most basic element that's common to Marxism and Keynesianism. And that is being reproduced all around us today. So whatever the macro stimulus will be in terms of fiscal expenditure, it's going to be offset not only by cutbacks at the state and municipal level, but by cutbacks in private industry, right, which is offsetting the ability of consumption to get going. Okay, so that's why we can't limit ourselves to a slightly more or less radical form of Keynesian inflation and thinking that it will necessarily solve the problem. And it should make us aware, as we were aware when we founded studies in political economy, that the gap between neoclassical economists and Keynesian economists is not as big as you think. And that's why it isn't that hard for so many of them to make the switch over the last few weeks or months. Secondly, we can't rely on private capitalists to solve social problems, social justice problems. And in that sense, I think the criticism that Brenda and Catherine began with around the Community Reinvestment Act is valid from the left. And as indeed Catherine said, it's valid from the left. We should be criticizing it. Because what happened in 1978, and it wasn't unique to the United States alone, was that in the face of the pressures of the Keynesian welfare state, governments were cutting back social expenditure. Just at the time they should have been rebuilding their cities at public expenditure, they were cutting back on that. So what did they do? They passed it, and it was a lot of very left-wing Democrats who were elected in the '74 Congress who did this, who had been leaders in the anti-Vietnam struggle, etc. Right? They passed a piece of legislation that required all banks to lend to poor areas in which they were operating in their communities. Every banker in the United States opposed this, except one Chicago banker who spoke in favor of it. Well, clearly they had to do a deal. Right? They did a deal. The deal was that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored mortgage agencies, would create a secondary market in mortgages. Now, there was already a secondary market in mortgages, but this certainly enormously enhanced it. Didn't go very far until Clinton came along and put amendments in, because after all, you had the crisis of the 80s, not that many poor people could access this, and he put in more regulations. Jesse Jackson went to Wall Street and said, we want our rainbow Wall Street. Right? And then, of course, and you saw this enormous increase in loans going to poor communities. That's not to say that the worst loans were located from that system. The worst loans were coming from the shysters that Bush allowed into the system in the early part of this decade. Every shyster was selling local bonds, and these were local developers. These were local developers who were in cahoots with particular local banks or trust companies. So we need to watch our localism. Now that also applies to solving the enormous ecological problems through private capitalists. One of the things this crisis should make us think about very, very carefully is carbon credit trading. Because that is based on the system of derivatives. That's what it relies on. Insofar as that doesn't function, then the system of solving the problem of the ecological crisis through credit derivative trading is screwed. And we realize that we are promoting solutions that are rooted in what we all seem to see as the cause of the problem. Right? This kind of asset inflation that the financial crisis has emerged out of. Thirdly, we need to reject, it seems to me, and this is what Adam was getting at, too sharp a separation between an analysis and solutions to the crisis that are based on a separation between finance and production. I agree very much with what Brenda said with regard to explanations of overaccumulation. I think they're often pedantic and Talmudic. And I think they're wrong in many respects. That said, we need to think seriously about how this crisis is linked to contradictions in production and what that means in terms of solutions. So there are those Marxist economists who think that we never got out of the crisis of the 70s. People like Brenner think that we've been stuck in a crisis since the 1970s. By virtue of profits not having recovered. And neoliberalism did not provide a solution to the crisis of the 70s. There are those, on the other hand, and I certainly am one of those, who think that the restructuring that did take place under neoliberalism, not least the defeat of trade unionism, did have the effect of restructuring the capitalist economy in the global ways that Adam was talking about. So it was very much connected to the flows of capital, removal of capital controls, as well as the defeat of trade unionism, in a way that did resolve the crisis and did restore profits. That said, then the question does become, well, even if this crisis was triggered in the financial sector, what was it about the production sector that made it so susceptible to this crisis having the effect in production that it's now having? And here, as Adam put it very well, and I won't spend much time on this, one does need to understand the linkages between finance and the globalization and integration of production. It's not just a matter of greedy capitalists in finance. When you have trade of this degree going on in the world, right, some of it inside multinational corporations, some of it between them, right, clearly we do have enormous uncertainty, as Brenda said. Currencies, whether someone will pay or not pay, right? You need to have an international financial order that is capable of valuing risk. And there was a dialectic, as Brenda and I were talking about at the break, between production and finance. Growing up, in fact, within the old Keynesian Bretton Woods era, that already exploded the old regulations, made them unviable, and made the integration of global production possible by virtue of the fact that you don't know what the price of oranges is going to be when you contract to buy them, to produce them and buy them 6 months from now, given currency changes, given volatility in capital markets, given credit for trade, et cetera, et cetera. So one needs to relate the way in which finance has exploded and produced this derivatives revolution to what has happened in production. Just as one needs to relate it insofar as poor people were lending too much, or just ordinary working people were borrowing too much. They were doing so precisely because of the wage stagnation, or worse, that was a solution to the profit crisis of the 1970s. And there's an element of underconsumption in explaining why so many people were relying on credit, whether it was through secondary mortgages or their credit cards or otherwise, in order to subsist or increase their standards of living. And that meant, of course, as soon as that gets cut off, their ability to be consumers gets cut off. Okay, so what are the do's? And very quickly. I've got 2 minutes left for the do's. I agree strongly with Brenda that we need to challenge individualism, that we need to try to, as Greg Alvo put it 10 years ago, shift towards inward-oriented development strategies rather than externally competitive-oriented development strategies as far as possible. And if that's what we mean by local community, I think that that's right. I think that Laurie was getting that in terms of patterns of agriculture that need to be changed. Back in the early 80s, many of us who founded SPE were trying to talk in terms of local job development boards that would be elected, just like school boards are now elected, and given the statutory responsibility of putting everyone in their community who wanted a job and didn't have one into a job, and that they would be funded freely by upper levels of government, as the school boards now are, and they could receive applications from firms, government agencies, co-ops, etc., for the kinds of stuff that might provide jobs. But even if you transfer the whole of the welfare state over to such boards, that wouldn't be enough to fund all of this when you've got unemployment, as we're about to do, of over 10%. So that's why you need to then start immediately talking about taking the financial system through which the surplus in our societies pass into the public domain and making the financial system a public utility. Even if you want local, or as much as you can, regionally organized production, you have to do that. You have to have that. So it isn't just a matter of nationalizing the banks in order to save them and then give them back to the capitalists, which is at best what is being talked about. It's a matter of making the case for finance being a public utility. So there's a case for it even made by bourgeois economists insofar as complex banking systems need government deposit insurance in order to function, right? And there's a stronger case to be made for it insofar as every credit crisis that we've lived through over the last 30 years, beginning with the Latin American debt crisis, has had governments acting as lenders of last resort, right? So then that's been repeated right up to and including this crisis. The only difference is that this one hasn't managed to stop through putting the finger in the dam, hasn't managed to stop the flood in the advanced capitalist countries. Right? It didn't manage to stop it in the poor countries before. So by all means, we need to critique individualism. We need to have more orientation to local planning and production and community organization. We need diversity. But we cannot have this in ways that don't depend on socialist strategy. We cannot have it. And it's an illusion to pretend that we can. And it's about time, after 30 years, that we went back to the drawing board and said so instead of being vague on these questions. You can't have it. Now, should we only nationalize the banks? No. Right? Obviously, if we're going to have the kind of solution to the ecological crisis that Laurie was talking about, we would also have to take the auto industry, it also wouldn't cost anything to do it now, into the public sector, and I mean including the parts sector, not only the auto sector, and to engage in a massive process of conversion, so that they are indeed producing vehicles for public transit, or at least individual vehicles that run on hydrogen or electricity, but much more than that, whereby the skilled tool and die makers, the skilled workers in those plants, would turn their skills to producing the type of machinery that allow for solar energy for other purposes. Now, here's finally what we need to do. I mean, just one more point in this respect, and it picks up Adam's point. The great danger of speaking in terms of internally oriented development, although I think a lot of the countries of the South are going to have to move in this direction, at least regionally as far as possible, is that we ignore at our peril the extent to which the freezing of credit markets will undermine global trade, what effect that will have not only on us but especially on the South, and the extent to which the ending of the flow of FDI to the third world, or the freezing up of bond markets, is going to throw third world countries, developing countries, into an appalling situation. It's going to be a situation like workers who keep complaining about capitalists exploiting them until the moment when they don't have a job. And now we're going to find that those people who complain about multinational corporations exploiting the third world are going to say, my God, pour in your foreign direct investment. Buy our bonds. And that's also why we need to think in terms of those type of cooperative socialist strategies. And they can only be cooperative because we can't go back to some form of autarky. And this brings us to the sixth point, which is what is the responsibility of socialist intellectuals? Well, it's enormous in this respect because we only get the vaguest outlines of what to do when we talk in terms of making banking a public utility, taking the auto industry into the public domain, engaging in a massive process of conversion, or indeed solidarity in terms of third world development. Those are the vaguest of proposals. Brenda's absolutely right to say, what about uncertainty and risk in a socialist transition? Do Marxist economists think about that? Because even if the banking sector is public, even the financial sector is public, you have to have some means of valuing whether you're going to put portions of the surplus here or there. If this is going to be viable as a socialist strategy globally, we need to perhaps start going back to the kind of thinking that Dexter White was engaged in at the very beginning of the Bretton Woods process, and he dropped it immediately because the balance of forces in the United States wouldn't allow it, which was that there ought to be cooperative capital controls. That is, if capital escapes the controls in one country, and you have an international set of agreements, the place that it's going to refuses to accept that capital on the grounds that it's escaping capital controls in the country that it has an agreement with. And those kinds of things are going to be necessary. They're the barest things that we need to start thinking about as socialist intellectuals, but if we don't get past, you know, there's a little more room in the house because 2 chickens have been taken out, we're not going to do that.